It is a pleasure to be here with you today. I enjoy meeting people throughout the community, especially in the social services community, but I know that there are people here that are from different professions, and so I just wanted to get a feel for who the audience is today. So as I do this presentation, I can make it applicable to some of the things you do in your everyday work. How many of you are in the social services field and work with clients in the community or patients? Okay, about half of you. How many of you are consumers here for education? How many of you are with education, teachers? Okay, I know there was hands that did not go up. Did I miss something? Anybody else that's from a different profession besides social services and education? Okay, so you work within the Department of Human Services, and that's wonderful. Well, it's good to have you here. Most of us in our professions, we're dealing with people who we take on the role as caregivers, and it's extremely important. This subject is extremely important to me, dealing with burnout and compassion fatigue. We're going to be talking about both of those today, what they are and what the difference is between just general burnout that all of us experience, and then what is compassion fatigue, which becomes a little bit more serious. And anybody that is in a caregiving role, even if you're just at home, I shouldn't say just, but if you're home taking care of somebody in a caregiver role, you can develop compassion fatigue in that role at home and may not realize some of the difficult challenges that you're going through really are how you are responding to the difficult things that you're facing in that role. Every one of us have probably experienced burnout in our lives at some point in a time or another, and we may not have recognized exactly what it was. So we'll be talking about some of those. And then they asked me right at the end if I would just do an update on psychiatric medications. What's sort of the new and upcoming thing in the last couple of years? And I hope that part's not too dry and boring to you, but we'll try to give you a little bit of an update of what's out there in the medical field. I work at the state hospital. I've been there 35 years. That's been my home in my profession. But I haven't always been in the field of psychiatry. I am a nurse practitioner by profession. I was previously, back in the 70s, an ICU nurse and wanted to be a shock trauma nurse and wanted to fly the life flight helicopter, which I don't know how I was ever going to be able to do that because I get motion sickness when I go up in a plane. So I learned very quickly early on in my life that may not work for me. But I came to Utah County to further my education as a nurse practitioner, and at that time, in the early 80s, there was a gluttony of nurses, and so you couldn't get a job anywhere. In fact, most facilities had a stack of applications, and they wouldn't even talk to you. And the only position I could find at that time was a weekend job at the state hospital working as a staff nurse. And it wasn't my intention to be in the field of psychiatry or work with clients in this particular area. But after working there for a year, I went back up to Salt Lake to work in a regular hospital, the LDS hospital, and found myself the entire time missing being with the patients at the state hospital. I had grown to love them and to care for them, and decided to switch my focus professionally and went back and got a degree as a psychiatric nurse practitioner. And I also do work at Wasatch Mental Health. I have my own group of chronic clients that I've seen for many years there and have a small private practice as well. So I've worked a lot with people that have dealt with some very significant and serious issues, and hi, how are you? And have just truly enjoyed sort of an area of my life that I really didn't believe or had any desire whatsoever when I was in school to end up in. And it's been a wonderful career, and I've totally enjoyed what I've done. But I can also tell you that during that time period, I apologize, I have to have my little kickstart there to keep going here. I've also experienced some pretty impactful things that affected my life even to this day. And so dealing with compassion fatigue became sort of dear to my heart as I looked at the people that I worked with at the state hospital and things that we were going through and things we weren't recognizing what we had to deal with. How many of you know who Viktor Frankl is? Anybody want to share? Who's Viktor Frankl? Somebody?
Psychologist or psychiatrist that was in the concentration camps.
Yeah, he was a Austrian neurologist and psychiatrist, and he survived the Holocaust. He was in the concentration camps, and he wrote a very famous book. Does anybody remember his book? Man's Search for Meaning. And one of the basic tenets of his book was when somebody is in some of the worst situations that life can present to you, how can you find meaning and purpose and peace in that environment? And this was a man who truly had to suffer trauma and experience some very difficult challenges in life. And one of his famous quotes was, "That which is to give off light must endure burning." And the meaning behind this meant a lot to me because every one of us in this profession, as we deal with people, no matter what our capacity is, we are going to experience painful situations. We are going to come across people who have experienced very traumatic events in their lives or are dealing with hopelessness and helplessness, suicide, sexual abuse, physical abuse, addiction issues, all sorts of family issues and difficulties. And how do we deal with that as we become the caregivers and the helpers, as we experience that pain with them? Many of us, as we grow up in this profession, really weren't trained. How do you recognize how you as an individual respond to these difficult situations? We had an experience about 25 years ago at the state hospital. Our social work director, his name was Rodney, was a very dear friend of mine, and just was one of the funnest people to be around that you could imagine. There wasn't a meeting that you went to that he didn't get you laughing or didn't lift the mood, and just made everybody feel really, really good. And very few people realize that Rodney dealt with serious major depression and also had relationship difficulties and was an alcoholic. He was able to hide that from most people who weren't too close to him. And then one day, sad news came to us at the state hospital when we arrived at work, and about a half hour later, we got the news that Rodney had died by suicide. It devastated our organization. There were so many people that were close to him and that he had touched their lives. And we were paralyzed. We didn't know how to move on as an organization, how to function. And we were really in disarray. And we reached out to some of our peers and colleagues in the community and said, we need somebody to come in and work with us and help us deal with this situation because we're not managing very well. And during that process, where we brought in some facilitators to talk to us and help us work through that grief, I recognized something that just sort of shocked me, and that was how many more people in our circles as we talked were dealing with similar issues, had been thinking about suicide, had been thinking about giving up, who were tired of the type of work we were doing and wanted to quit but didn't know what to do. And we started to recognize that we were not taking care of ourselves. We were not recognizing in ourselves or each other that we needed assistance and support in the type of work we were doing and to be able to reach out to other people. So that began a long process at the state hospital where we developed programming so we could reach out and provide resources to our employees and education to help them recognize when they might be dealing with the reaction to some of the trauma we were experiencing at work, at the same time reconciling that with our own challenges in life, because we all have difficulties, we all have challenges, and how do you reconcile that and then go to a work where you're faced with multiple difficulties, kids that have been traumatized or kids that come from difficult families, or adults who don't want to live anymore, feel hopeless. How do you move on from that? What we learn is that pain is mandatory in this life. None of us are going to get away from it. But suffering is not. How we manage our pain is vital and critical to our effectiveness and ability to work as professionals. And as people, we also can learn how to live happier and more peaceful lifestyles if we can understand that actual suffering isn't necessarily have to be a part of the painful experiences that we go through. And most of us don't realize that, because most of us, when we experience pain, we move into the suffering part of that, and we'll talk about that as we go through here. Healthcare workers, we're faced with a lot of challenges. We engage in a caretaking role with a desire to make a difference. How many of you went into your profession because you care about people and wanted to help others? Yeah, I think every one of us, right? I don't think there's too many of us that go into a caretaking role because we're being forced to, you know. We like working with people. We enjoy our associations with people. We like to see people get help and get better. And so there's a certain type of individual that's drawn to these professions, whether it's we have our own needs to be taken care of. Sometimes we get drawn into these types of roles because we also feel a need to be connected with people. I know that for years in graduate schools in psychology, when they would do their dissertations, one of the questions that some teams would ask the candidates is, now tell us what was wrong in your life that caused you to go into this profession. And it was a very challenging question, because here's these young people that had gone through their PhD training that were defending their dissertations and like, well, wait a minute, I haven't thought about my own issues. I'm here to learn about all the dysfunction and diagnoses and treatment and testing and assessments for others. But it's a very challenging issue to ask yourself, why am I in a caretaking role in my life? We're exposed to many tragic and stressful situations. We see violence. This is something that happens a lot in our professions. One of the things we deal with on a daily basis are patients at the state hospital who are very aggressive and physically violent. We have staff members sometimes that have to be on a 2-to-1 staff with an individual who might be extremely violent. I actually get text messages through an electronic system that tell me every day if there has been an incident at the state hospital, so I know something has happened that was a possible violent episode where somebody may have been injured. And sometimes you will have 2 or 3 people injured on a weekly basis, and sometimes more. We actually hit one point in time when I sent 15 employees to the emergency room in 1 month because of the violence we're exposed to. How do we deal with that? How do we help people cope with that kind of stuff? There's many individuals that are in private practice who are out there, and they're dealing with people who are rape victims, who are sexual abuse victims, who have dealt with trauma, or maybe they're vulnerable, disabled adults who haven't been able to protect themselves. Many of those are more susceptible to abuse than the average population, and we already know rates of abuse are very high. Many times these individuals feel helpless and hopeless, and they just don't see answers, so they look to us to instill that hope in them. And how are we going to instill hope in people that feel hopeless? We work hard and we get very few external rewards, okay? None of you look at your paycheck every 2 weeks and say, wow, I am rich, right? We're either state employees or we're working on grants or whatever, but we don't get a lot of financial rewards. We don't get a lot of material rewards. But also, it's very difficult in this kind of profession to get rewards from the people we work with. We have to find that intrinsically by the values that we have, that we see people getting better. I enjoy seeing somebody accomplish something. Somebody was able to achieve something that meant something in their life, and that gave me satisfaction. So it's an intrinsic thing. I don't get a lot of people that come up and celebrate and give me Oscars or awards or certificates too often. And so we privately and personally have to deal with the rewards that we receive in our kind of professions. And we frequently do not give the same nurturing to ourselves as we give to other people. I would bet that most of you don't sit down and do a personal assessment on how well you're doing each day, what your mood level is, how well you've been sleeping, have you been eating well, did you get your exercise in this week, how are you getting along with others, have you had any acting out behaviors this week? How many of you do that kind of assessment on yourself? Do you teach yourself stress management skills? How many of you have done relaxation techniques in the last week for yourself? Okay, about 10% of you. You can be excused. You probably understand this stuff. But most of us are not taking care of ourselves. We do not practice what we preach very well in the healthcare professions. Most of us have very stressful jobs. Is your job stressful? How many of you have a stressful job? What is stressful about your job?
Having a bunch of clients that just don't like me, they don't like being around me as much.
All right, many of us work with patients or clients who really aren't interested in the services we're providing them. I deal with the state hospital. Everybody that comes to state hospital is court ordered to be there. They don't come because they are excited and have been looking on the internet of where can I go get the best help in the state of Utah. It's the state hospital. I think I'll sign up to go. Okay, they don't like us and they don't want to be there. And many of them are not insightful enough to understand why that's benefiting them. Who else has a stressful job? What are some of the things that are stressful in your work?
So many tasks, and the task load is so high that it's hard to maintain relationships because there's just some things that happen.
We are so busy. How do we get it all done? You know, I have so many employees that talk to me and say, boy, we just don't see you very often. We want to see you more out on the unit walking around. And man, I would love to get out as an administrator and walk around and say hi to all 850 of you each day. But my boss is expecting me to have a report up in Salt Lake in 2 hours, and I just can't get away from my desk. But we don't understand that. We have very limited resources and time. But sometimes we have to reprioritize, and that's one of the aspects of looking at ourselves, because sometimes I get trapped in my head and think I don't have options. And so sometimes when we get stuck in that limited resource and limited time trap in our head, one of the stressful things is we become clouded in our thinking, and we become a little bit jaded, and then we start getting a little bit resentful. What are other things that are stressful? Resources, people. We don't have those things available to us to assist us. So sometimes we feel vulnerable because we don't have the right level of staff. There's not enough money in the system to do what we need to do, so we have to work with those limited resources. What are other stressors? Assisting people that are struggling, that are burnout, that might be having a difficult time. Somebody else raised their hand.
We're kind of the same thing, we work at the same place, but the staff shortages, the staff that we do have are working overtime to fill in those vacancies. We've got to have coverage.
So we're tired. We're doing extra work, aren't we? Sometimes we do the work of 2 or 3 people, and it gets tiring, and it's hard to come to work. How many of you work under federal regulations, state standards? We have liabilities that if we don't meet certain standards, there's that expectation on us, you're going to fail. And so some of those stressful things are the fact that I don't know how I'm going to do this, and there's pressure that I could lose my job if I don't do it right, or somebody might come in and audit me and find something wrong. As we look at all these different things that can cause us stress, the other thing is just human behavior. How many of you think there's stress in relationships with coworkers and bosses and supervisors? How many of you have never wanted to stay home from work because you didn't want to run into a coworker who's been bugging you, or you didn't want to work with them because they were dragging everybody down, or a supervisor who didn't seem to get off your back? And you were like, I'm sick of this job and I don't want to go anymore. Okay, so there's many different factors. What are the side effects of that kind of a stressful job? This is besides the compassion fatigue that we're going to talk about from just being the caretakers. So we'll think of that as we go through here. But many of us, the side effects end up that we start developing a bad attitude. We start griping and complaining about our job. We go home and we unload on our family members. We might even start escaping into some unhealthy behaviors, risk-taking behaviors ourselves that become very detrimental to us. Whether we start self-medicating with alcohol, or we start sleeping more, or we start having physical difficulties and physical illnesses, that stress can begin to affect us, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. But when it all seems overwhelming at times, we sometimes just want to walk away and procrastinate what we want to get done, and we just don't get the job done. Sometimes we look at our job and just think, this is way overwhelming. Let's just, why don't we just go to lunch first before we try to tackle this assignment? Each one of us has something that feels a little bit overwhelming to us, that we just think, I just can't do this today. This is just going to be too hard for me. And it doesn't matter what role you're in, if you're a clinical professional, or you're a legal assistant, or you're a secretary, or you're a case manager, or you're a psych tech or an attendant, whether you're in housekeeping or food services, there will always be something about your job that you just look at and say, I just don't want to do this today. Every one of us. How many of you have experienced that? Okay. So none of us are immune from this phenomena that can happen to us. Some other stressors that come to us are technology changes. I do not deal well with technology. I don't understand it. When the IT guys come in and start talking to me about new programs and things we have to start doing, I just ignore it until my secretary comes in and says, Dallas, you have to learn how to do this. We can't move forward if you don't get this. And so then I have to force myself to try to learn something new, and that's very difficult. Every one of us face those kind of things, and it gets a little bit irritating. We don't deal with change very well, and sometimes change can be stressful in a work environment. New leadership, new policies, new programs get implemented, and those things can cause us stress at work, and we see those things coming. Sometimes we can get excited about it because we know a change is needed to take place. But in most cases, even if it's good or bad, that can cause increased anxiety for us and stress. So we face many challenges as healthcare workers. We have limited resources. We have a very confusing healthcare system. I get people all the time that call me on the phone and they've got a family member in crisis and they say, what do? We don't know where to turn. There is no instruction sheet out there that says this is where you should go. Who is the provider that I should turn to? My insurance company won't pay for this and I don't know what to do anymore. Or I don't have insurance and I don't know who will treat me. And I spend so much time trying to explain to people the frustrating system that we work in healthcare, and it's overwhelming to people. And many people don't access services because it's overwhelming. When I was promoted to the superintendent in 2005 at the state hospital, I told my bosses up in Salt Lake, I said, I can do clinical work pretty well, and I enjoy doing management and organization. I enjoyed program development, but I flunked math in school, and I'm a terrible accountant. And if you saw my checkbook, you wouldn't want me to be in charge of this $70 million budget. And that was one of my weaknesses. And I told them up front, I'm not a budget guy, so you better help me with this. Is there somebody that can come down from the department and help me understand Medicaid and Medicare? They had no one that understood it that could come and talk to me. Not one finance person could come and explain how a state hospital budget worked under the Medicaid plan. They said, why don't you contact the Department of Health, who oversees the Medicaid money that comes through the state, and see if there's somebody there that can help you. So I contacted the Department of Health. You know what I was told? We have no one here that understands state hospital budgets with Medicaid and Medicare. There happens to be a lady at the University of Utah Hospital who's worked there for years that we think will understand this, and they gave me her name and her number. So I called this total stranger at the University of Utah and said, "You have no idea who I am, but I got your name from the Department of Health, and they said you might be able to help me understand how hospitals work under the Medicaid system." And she laughed for a minute, and then she said, "I'm really sorry, but I'm retiring in 30 days, and I don't have time to help you." So, over the next few years, and trying to hire somebody who had an MBA, which we didn't have at the state hospital, and somebody that understood finances, and we made some pretty significant mistakes before he got there. In fact, we did something that I had no idea was wrong. We took $1 million out of one year's budget and put it in the next year because we had extra money. I didn't know you couldn't do that unless the legislature approved that. And so, it came all the way down from the governor's office. Who's this guy at the state hospital moving our money around? And so I said, "Oh, well, I didn't know I couldn't do that." And they said, "Well, now you do, and if you do it again, you'll lose your job." So I thought, well, somebody needs to really help me understand what I'm doing. You can imagine the stress that was of dealing with finances and people don't understand it. And then you're supposed to help people understand how they can apply for Medicaid and Medicare and all these things and understand financial issues. So that was a big learning curve for me. And over the past 13, almost 14 years, I think I understand this much now, but I have a really good finance guy who just comes in and tells me whether I can write a check or not. So I'm relying on him to understand what we're doing. We have very difficult clinical cases. I don't know how many of you deal with clients that have mental illness or disabilities, but we all know that one individual that we have in the system that's costing us hundreds of thousands of dollars because nobody knows what to do with them. Or it's just somebody who comes in the system that's very disruptive. I remember years ago when I first started at the state hospital, we'd sit there in staff meeting and they would say, "We have a new admission coming this week, and it's a young 24-year-old young lady with borderline personality disorder." And then I would hear all these groans in the staff, "Oh no, not another one." And I would think, well, what do you mean by that? And then I learned very quickly what kind of chaos a borderline personality disorder person can create in an environment like a mental health unit at the state hospital. And so all of a sudden, it was another learning curve I had to go through. And those become very stressful as you deal with patients who are very violent and knowing that staff are being traumatized, or somebody who's threatening to sue everybody. Those are sometimes things that can cause you stress. Family members that want to sue you can cause stress because of those difficult situations. And these are the liabilities and risk factors we deal with in our work, is we're constantly feeling like Big Brother's looking over our shoulder, wondering if we're meeting all the expectations we're supposed to be accomplishing within the rules and regulations that we work under. We have limited external rewards and poor salaries, and we also deal with a lot of public scrutiny. We've all heard jokes about state employees, right? How many state employees does it take to dig a hole? About 20, one to use the shovel and 19 to watch and give instructions, those kind of jokes. Those wear on you after a while, because every one of us know when we go to work, we work hard. We are earning our money. There may be a few people that don't really have good work ethic, but that happens in all industry. And yet, people in the community think that as public employees, as public servants, we just like to go do nothing and get paid for it. And that's such a stigma towards people within the social services and education departments that we have to face that stigma ourselves. We don't deal with it as much as people who deal with stigma in mental health. For example, if I was to ask all of you, how many of you, if you had to have a medical procedure done, like your gallbladder out, or you had high blood pressure, or had to go to the doctor to get something managed like your insulin checked or something changed, would have no problem sharing those kind of things with family members and friends and even neighbors? We can all talk about our medical issues. You may not want to share your next colonoscopy exam with your friends, but most things we can talk about. But if you were just discharged from a psychiatric behavioral health unit at Utah Valley Hospital because you were feeling suicidal, how comfortable would you feel sharing that with your neighbor? How many of you could share that openly? Why not? Shame. Why should we feel ashamed? We don't need to. Why do we?
Society puts negative connotations on mental illness that maybe aren't true.
Yeah, people with disabilities, people with mental illness, we stigmatize them, we judge them. If somebody with schizophrenia moves into the neighborhood, all of a sudden everybody's vigilant of their children because we have these notions that these people are more violent than the average population, crazy, lunatics. If anybody's ever seen One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, you'll understand how that stigma gets reinforced.
My favorite comment is it's all in your head. I'm thinking, so what's wrong with everything's in your head?
That's right. That's where my brain is, so it is all in my head, right? But that's absolutely right. And there are many people who do not understand depression, which is the most common illness in our entire world. Because we all feel sad, we all feel discouraged, we all get frustrated, but we don't want to acknowledge that we might have depression because we might get judged for being weak or incapable or not worthy. Not too many years ago, there was a national survey done, and 40% of the people that answered this question, what is the cause of mental illness, responded that it was due to sin or a moral defect in character. I actually had a legislator once tell me, I refuse to put more funding into the mental health system until these people learn to change their behaviors. I was shocked. I just looked at him like, wow, really? We have a lot of work to do, it sounds like. How many of you remember what the WOG disease was? W-O-G. The wrath of God. Anybody know what that was? AIDS. Back in the 80s, people called it the WOG disease because we didn't care if it wiped out everybody that had it, because it was God's punishment for their behaviors. And yet the mentally ill face that same kind of stigma. Well, we as healthcare professionals, we buy into that stigma. If I can't deal with mental illness stigma myself, my patient population, the people I work with, are going to know that. They can sense that in my relationship with them. The way I interact with them, the way I treat them is going to be directly impacted by the fact that I haven't dealt with the stigma issues myself. So we as healthcare professionals have to look at that, because if I start developing symptoms of anxiety and depression myself because I'm suffering from something like compassion fatigue that we're going to talk about, do you think I'm going to go get help? Do you think I'm going to tell my supervisor I'm struggling? Do you think I'm going to talk to my family that I can't sleep and I feel sad and I feel like quitting my job and I want to possibly end my life? If I'm not willing to talk about those things openly as a professional, how can I help my patient deal with some of the challenges that they have to face? Think about that for just a second. Where are you at in your own personal life in dealing with some of the stigma issues that we face? We as state employees, sometimes we might be even embarrassed to say we work for the state because we think people are going to think immediately, oh, you're just a government employee. We have to get past those shame issues, those guilt issues, and those stigma issues, and get past the public scrutiny of what we're dealing with to be able to deal with some of the stresses. We have many negative outcomes because of the work we experience. Some of you might think about these negative consequences. You don't have to speak out, but I would just say, think about just for a second about the negative things that have happened to you because of the impact of your work environment. As we go through these in a little bit, we're going to talk about some of the symptoms you might be experiencing or dealing with, but I want you just to think about that. Sometimes we get to a point in our situations in life where we feel powerless, that we can't change things, that we can't impact anything, that we're out of control. There's nothing we can do about the situation. And when we start feeling that powerlessness, then it's really going to start impacting us for the worst. So we have to think about, am I really self-aware each day how the things that transpire within my environment, the things that I'm doing at work, how are they actually impacting me? I can see the stress and I can feel the stress and I can gripe and complain about the stress, but am I really mindful of the impact that that stress is having on me as a person? So we're going to talk about compassion, fatigue, and burnout. These are two separate issues. One leads to the other. We all experience one, and not all of us experience the other. Burnout is not a disorder. It's a state that we get ourselves in because of the overwhelming stress. It becomes a thought process, something that we're going to talk about what goes on in our mind when we become burned out. But it can become a chronic problem for us if we don't deal with it. But compassion fatigue actually is a syndrome that becomes more clinical, that we then usually will need some kind of support, whether that's just help from our support system, family and friends, or whether it's professional help, depends on how serious it is. It's estimated that about 30% of psychiatrists actually experience compassion fatigue and burnout. And they are required in their CME requirements every 2 years to have an in-service on this very thing. So that was one of the things that we developed in our CME program at the state hospitals, helping our doctors look at this very thing. But most healthcare workers don't even focus on this kind of stuff. And we very rarely see this kind of information and training when we go out to professional conferences. We're always focused on what is best practice in the clinical care of our clients, but we very seldom look at what is best practice in taking care of us as professionals. Some of this is built into the supervisory roles we get in professional disciplines. When you go through graduate training, you're required so many hours of supervision. Most of that is focused on what we call countertransference, your relationship with your client. So supervisors are supposed to help new trainees, interns and residents and others. How do you deal with those transference issues when you're working with somebody that's dealing with very difficult mental health or psychological issues in life or disabilities? But what they don't really focus on as supervision is self-care and self-nurturance. I had a time in my life in my graduate program where we had a family member who died by suicide, and it was a very stressful time in our life. Work was very stressful for me at the state hospital. I had just been promoted to the assistant clinical director role, and I was taking on a big project at work. And I was doing my training at a methadone clinic in Salt Lake, and so I had to be at the clinic by 6 o'clock in the morning when they were distributing the methadone and then doing therapy on the methadone clients afterwards. I was so tired, I was not getting anything done. I was inefficient. I wasn't very effective in my sessions with the patients. I wasn't tracking things. I wasn't getting my reports done on time. And I had a very astute professor who came up to me and said, "Dallas, you're not cutting it. Something's not working for you right now. And this is not the you I'm used to. And I really think you need to take a year off." So she recommended I take a year sabbatical from school and just go get my life back in order and take care of the stressors that I needed to deal with. That was a very tough thing to face, because here I was, I had peers in school and colleagues, and I'm thinking, I can't do this job. And so I started to feel this overwhelming burden that I'm failing at this. And what I realized was, no, you weren't failing. You just had so much going on in your life at that time. You were taking care of so many people that were grieving at home and trying to hold everything together and be the glue that was making everything okay, that I wasn't taking care of myself. And that was probably the best thing that ever happened to me in my professional career, was taking that year off school and just rebooting whatever it was in the bandwidth of my brain so that I could start facing some of the things I had to deal with. That was a very difficult time, but I will always be grateful to that professor and friend of mine who was willing to come up to me and say, this isn't working, and you need to look at things a little bit differently. It is very preventable. The term burnout and compassion fatigue came out into the psychological literature in about the 1970s. We really started talking about it and understanding that it was a significant issue that we needed to understand. The negative consequences of just burnout itself are mainly job dissatisfaction. If you start not liking your job and you start asking yourself, I really don't want to go to work today. I don't like what I do anymore. I'm not getting any rewards personally. I go home and I think, oh, that was a tough day. If that starts happening more than just a few times, you need to ask yourself, am I reaching a point of time in my life when I'm a little burned out and need to start focusing back on what I need to do to take care of myself? We start losing our passion and idealism and purpose for what we're doing. We just don't feel excited anymore to go to work. I love creating new programs and doing things. I love the challenge of taking on something new. I remember back in the mid-'80s, I was asked to be in charge of a sex offender recovery program for the state. I had no idea how to work with sex offenders at the time. I didn't understand them. The whole issue of victimization and traumatization, I had focused on that with clients, but never looked at it from the perpetrator side for treatment. And so I spent the next couple of years really learning about what that all meant. And we put together a great program in the state that was very successful. But unfortunately, due to resources, it closed a few years later. But doing those kind of things was exciting. But when I go to work, I told my wife, I says, I've worked 35 years. When I get up in the morning and I don't want to go to work anymore and I've lost that passion, that's when I will retire. If we're not feeling it, then we're not going to enjoy it, and it's going to lead us to a bad place in our lives. It diminishes our job performance. If you start noticing that you can't get things done the way you usually do them, if people are starting to become critical of your work, if you start getting feedback from a supervisor that things aren't happening the way they're supposed to, if you just feel like it now takes me 4 hours to get done what I used to be able to get done in 1 hour, or I used to be able to multitask and I can't do that anymore, that's usually something you should step back and say, I'm capable of doing this and I'm not doing it right now. Something's wrong. And then we start seeing a change in our work habits. We start losing some of our ethics towards work. We might start having trouble getting out of bed in the morning, showing up to work late, wanting to leave work early, taking longer lunch breaks than we know we're supposed to, sitting around and wasting time at work, sitting on the internet doing things we know we're not supposed to be doing. Those kind of work ethic things start happening to us, then we need to start asking ourselves, am I really okay? If I'm supposed to be prepared for something at work, at a meeting or some class or do something and I'm not prepared like I usually am, that should be a flag. I'm not performing to the level that I should be and I don't care anymore. And that's an important thing, is if I don't really care that I didn't do it the way I usually can do it, then I need to say to myself, there's a problem here because I've lost that. And if we start becoming cynical, if I start becoming sarcastic about the people that I'm taking care of and just negative and, oh my gosh, this person's driving me crazy, I just don't want to work with them anymore, or they're never going to get better, they never listen to me, I don't want to see anybody else because these people never want to get better, I'm tired of working with this population. If we start really becoming critical and sarcastic and somebody says to you, wow, you got a bad attitude today, you might want to take a step back and say, oh, okay, maybe I need to look at myself a little bit. Maybe I'm doing something or not doing something for myself, and unfortunately that's impacting everybody else. If I start isolating myself a little bit and not wanting to talk to the people around me, and I start disengaging from my coworkers, and I start disengaging from my family members, and I start not talking to people about what's going on with me, that's a serious problem. And I start having this sense of failure, and I start feeling very apathetic and don't care anymore. And it really turns into a poor morale issue. We start feeling very depersonalized and just don't feel like anybody cares anymore. I'm going to try to do this without losing my slideshow. Some of you remember this Geico commercial.
And that's why it never makes me sad, I think. That's interesting. You know what makes me sad?
You do! Maybe we should chug on over to Mamby-Pamby land, where maybe we can find some self-confidence for you, you jackwagon!
Tissue?
Geico. 15 minutes could save you 15% or more.
How many of you remember that Geico commercial about the drill sergeant who doesn't make a good therapist? Okay. I want you to read this for a second. I want you to think about which words stick out to you the most. Burnout is the result of poor coping when perceived demands outweigh perceived resources. What word on there stands out the most to you? Perceived? Okay, you guys are pretty good. Most people will look at that and they'll say demands. So maybe you guys are following this a little bit better than most of my audiences do. But usually people will focus on the demands, our workload, our working relationship, expectations of our bosses, policies and standards, and our patient needs, and then our short staff and our technology issues. But what really is important is for us to start thinking about how are we coping, and usually our coping depends on how we're perceiving our current situation. Because what we find is about 80 to 90% of our burnout symptoms are caused by our attitude and how we're perceiving what we're actually going through, not the stress itself. So we actually create ourselves some pretty difficult challenges. Part of this is due to why we're susceptible to burnout is because we have poor inattention to our self-regulation. We think that others are controlling us. We think that we don't have any say-so in things. And we really believe that what we're going through is the fault of somebody else. This is the boss's problem. He's making me feel this way. This work sucks. I hate coming to this place. This environment is a terrible place to work. This organization doesn't care about me as an employee. Nobody ever does anything for me. When you start getting into that black and white thinking that everything here is bad, nobody cares about me, and you feel like you're a victim, that's when this is going to start really perpetuating and reinforcing in your head. You have to be very careful how you perceive that. I had a situation when I was a program director on a forensic unit where we had about 70 employees, and I was getting messages from the employees that morale was really bad, and people were really unhappy about the way the unit was running. And it was interesting because as I would talk to people and ask for their feedback, most people I talked to were just like, oh, I'm okay. But I think everybody is unhappy here. And so I thought, well, we need to do something. We need to have a retreat and get together as a group and really sit down and talk about what's going on, what am I not doing as the director here to help you, and why are we having such a problem with morale here? But before we did the retreat, I ran a survey of all the employees, and I just asked 2 questions. The first question was, how many of you are happy working on the unit? And the second question was, how many of you think your coworkers are happy working on the unit? 85% of the employees, almost 90%, said, I'm happy or very happy working on the unit. 85 to 90% of the employees said all their coworkers were unhappy working on the unit. We got together in a retreat, and I presented that data to the group. What do you think the conclusion was? There were 3 very anxious people in the room. Who were these 3 anxious people? They were the ones who had lost their passion. They were the ones who were burned out. They were the ones that were struggling, but they were the ones griping and moaning and undermining, and had pretty much convinced everybody else that the place sucked. And nobody was happy. Everybody had bought in, and their perception was, because I keep hearing this, everybody must be unhappy. When we dealt with that as a group, they all started talking to each other going, yeah, I don't know why we bought into that, because I'm really happy. I like the way things are running. Our schedules are fair. Our staffing is good. Our patients are doing well. We couldn't put a finger on it, but sometimes there is a bad apple in the mix. And those people will weigh us all down. And they have a negative attitude. They're very pessimistic. They love to be sarcastic. They love to undermine. And it's like it empowers them to feel like they have control over something because they feel powerless in their role. So we could have just called them in and confronted them and said, you know what? I'm going to write you guys up because you've impacted the attitude and morale of the entire unit. Was that the right approach? Not necessarily. Now, sometimes you might get somebody that absolutely refuses to work with you. But the approach was, what can we do to help change how you're feeling, to help you take better care of yourself, to help you enjoy coming to work more? What is it that we need to do? Why do you feel so powerless? Sometimes people feel like nobody listens to me. Nobody wants to hear my opinion. Nobody lets me contribute to what goes on around here. And we start feeling like nobody cares. I have no value, no worth here in this environment, in this organization. And I can perceive my self-worth as being diminished. We have to be very careful with those perceptions, and we have to check those things out. And when we see somebody that's in our environment working around us that might be pulling us down, we have to look at that and say, you know what? I have to self-regulate myself. I want to be able to come to work and enjoy it. And when you're not doing well, it really impacts the rest of us. And it's okay to sit down and say, what can we do to help you feel better about coming here? Now, some people are just really obnoxious and annoying, and we just don't want to work with them, and it's their personality, and no matter what we do, they just drive us all crazy, right? How do you adapt to individuals like that within your environment? Anybody ever work with somebody like that? Nobody wants to raise their hand because you might be sitting next to them. Sometimes it is difficult. We can't fix everything. There's not an answer to everything. But we have to be very careful because there's a dynamic that will happen in those situations. Does anybody know what it is? We start becoming divided and we triangulate and we become compartmentalized in our communication and we start undermining and gossiping and talking and bad-mouthing. When that starts happening within your environment, we have a dysfunctional system and it is going to come back and bite us individually. We cannot escape the negative impact that that will have in your environment. You have to be very careful when you're dealing with the stressful type of work we do. You know, you hear stories about fire departments and police officers and people that just go in and the first responders, and you see these wonderful stories about how they have each other's back and they take care of each other. They're trained to do that. Military groups that have to go in and it's a life and death situation. You have to communicate and you have to care about the other person and take care of them because they're going to take care of you. In our type of work where we deal with trauma and we are dealing with very difficult situations and we are caregivers and working with stress on a daily basis, we have to have the attitude that the relationships we have with others around us are critical to our own professional survival. And we have to overlook the weaknesses and those things that bug us about other people because every one of us, I can promise you, I have things that bug the heck out of my staff. But we have to work with those things and we have to overcome them and we have to take care of ourselves and not make ourselves vulnerable by buying into some of that unhealthy behavior that takes place in the work setting. I can promise you almost every time you're dealing with a poor morale situation, you'll go in and there'll be relationship conflicts within the office or the setting you're in. People aren't getting along. People are undermining each other. Sometimes it's competitiveness to who gets to do what. We don't deal very well with those kind of things. We have to look at ourselves and say, am I participating in that unhealthy behavior? Because I promise you, you're going to take that home, and that's going to wear on you, and you're going to start feeling the physical and emotional effects of that negative environment that you're working in. Yes?
I went to training a long time ago, and the presenter talked about stomach acid. So if your stomach acid is greater than the other person, then you need to figure out what's going on. As a manager, sometimes you have an employee that you need to let go. And, it's not, you can't always agree on everything.
Absolutely.
There needs to be some respect and professionalism. Sometimes you have
There are times when you'll have a toxic person in the environment that has to be let go. That's absolutely true. That is unwilling to look at themselves or is incapable of working in that environment. And truly, we have done that. I've seen that happen multiple times. Not often, but it does happen. Where it's just better for everybody involved, including the people we're taking care of. If we don't deal with those things, it's going to directly impact our effectiveness as care providers, and we won't be very effective. Burnout cause is basically, as we've talked about, the perceived demands upon us and the perceived resources not being enough to take care of those demands, and that turns into a perceived threat, okay? That perceived threat, if you think of yourself in a situation where you're under stress, you feel like you can't get the job done, or there's too much being asked of you, your body is actually going to be in a stressful state of fight or flight. And I'm sure most of you have studied about the impacts of hormones and cortisol on the system. We know it's neurotoxic. We know it can affect the limbic system. We know that it can affect different things such as our working memory, our cognitive abilities, our judgment, our emotions, our sleep, our appetite. All of these can be affected by those increases in cortisol and changes in our hormone levels. This sympathetic dominance results in chronic anxiety, and this is what tends to lead to burnout, is if we're not dealing with that chronic anxiety within the environment that we're working with, and we may not even notice it. Most people don't recognize that they might be in a mild state of fight or flight on a regular basis, and that is eating away at them physically. If you're dealing with more physical issues, headaches, upper or lower back pain, stomach problems, constipation or diarrhea, generalized malaise or fatigue, if you're dealing with these kind of physical symptoms, we always start thinking about what medically is going wrong with me. I need to go to the doctor and get a workup. Maybe my thyroid's not working well, or maybe my iron is low, or I have a poor deficiency with vitamin D or something. We start trying to explain it away with all these medical answers and etiologies, and let's go do a lab test and find out why I feel so terrible. How many times do you step back and say, maybe I'm just dealing with chronic anxiety? Now, some people do have anxiety disorders, and they're very well aware of what that means, and they can recognize it pretty quickly because they've been in treatment. But what we recognize is in the basal ganglia of the brain, the activity level goes up, the metabolic activity level when you're in that chronic state of anxiety, which is low grade. As you can see the red part in that high anxiety area, this is where the emotions communicate with the cognitive brain. And when those emotions are out of whack, the cognitive brain is not going to work well, and it is going to send adrenaline and epinephrine through your system. Your adrenal glands are going to respond, and you're going to have all sorts of problems physiologically because of that. The bottom picture is what a normal brain should look like. So if you're under a lot of stress and burnout, your brain might be in that chronic state where it is fatiguing itself, and you might be doing yourself some real biological damage by not taking care of yourself. And it results in what we call the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis dysfunction. Your body starts not dealing well with the stress it's going through. How many of you have ever had to give a public speech, like at church or in front of a large crowd? Okay. How many of you enjoy doing that? Only a couple of you. How many of you have been up there in front of people and your anxiety level's high and all of a sudden you can't remember what you wanted to say, you can't recall sort of the thoughts you put together, the way you communicated it comes out wrong, it's not the way you wanted to say it, and you completely go blank, so you then end up reading the whole thing off a piece of paper and then you sit down and feel stupid, right? Okay. Then you sit down and you slow down and you think, dang it, why didn't I say this? Or this is what I prepared to say and I didn't say what I wanted to say. And all of a sudden all the cognitions come flooding back into your mind. That's because that access is not working while you're stressed out giving that talk, and your emotional brain and your cognitive brain become disengaged with each other and you can't think right. Okay? Well, if this is happening to you every day at a low level, can you imagine how your performance level is not going to be very good if it's chronic? Now, sometimes a little bit of stress motivates us and we do okay, but most of the time we don't do so well, okay? Now, I'm going to describe something to you that gives a little bit more of an emotional understanding of what these threats can be like. And I was going to draw it up on the board, but because of time, I think I'll just go through this drawing for you, and I hope you can see it, but I'll explain it to you a little bit here. This is a model of emotional stress that I use that helps people understand the emotional triad of pain, fear, and anger, okay? We know that pain is mandatory. Every one of us are going to experience pain in our life. There are 4 reasons we experience pain in our life. Physical pain is the most obvious. The other one is loss, failure, and rejection. When you experience pain in life, you can track it back to one of these 4 reasons, okay? Now, they can take on a lot of meaning. Loss can be the loss of a loved one, the loss of a job, the loss of money, the loss of control, a perceived loss, anything that feels just losing your keys. Can be any kind of loss that can create a little bit of stress and pain. Failing at something, I'm no good, I'm incompetent, I'm not as good as others, I'll never get the job, I can't do well in math, I'm not a very good father, husband, I'm not a very good clinician, I'm not a very good worker. You know, anything that makes us feel like we're a failure, or I'm wrong, I'm stupid, I don't understand, people make me feel bad about myself. Rejection, we don't feel like we're a part, we don't belong. You know, maybe a relationship breakup causes pain, that can be loss and rejection. So any of these things that we experience in life can cause pain. Now, we're not taught in life very well to deal with pain. We're very poor subjects at learning that pain is just a normal part of life. Okay, we have joy and pain in life, yet we just want one side of the continuum. None of us want to be on the other side. We do not learn that that's something we can actually learn that's okay, just like Viktor Frankl did. We develop another emotion which tells us we are going to be hurt or feel pain, and that is fear. Fear is the flag that says something is going to hurt us. And we know we're afraid because of our anxiety. Anxiety is the emotion that tells us we are experiencing fear. So anytime I'm feeling anxious for any reason, my brain, my subconscious and conscious brain, is going to think that something is a threat to me to hurt me in some way. So my brain's going to try to normalize that in any way possible. It is not safe to be here in this environment. It is not a good place. I don't feel comfortable here. I want out of this. I don't like my situation. I may not understand that anxiety, but my brain has got me on high alert. Because most of us don't deal with our fear of being hurt, we've learned a very effective coping mechanism in our society of using a tertiary emotion called anger as a way to deal with our fear of being hurt. Now, anger gets manifested in multiple ways. The most obvious is rage. I can show you I'm angry by throwing things and yelling and screaming and hitting. But I can also be angry by being silent. Have you ever been mad at a partner or somebody and you just don't talk to them for 3 days because I'm going to show you I'm ticked? and I'm not going to talk to you. And if they come up to you and say, are you mad at something? You say, no, I'm not mad. What's wrong with you? Sarcasm is a form of anger. Defensiveness, how come you didn't get that done? Well, you didn't tell me I needed to do it right now. We get defensive because our anxiety goes up and we don't want to feel like a failure. So I get defensive because I don't want the pain that comes with you making me feel stupid. Jealousy is a form of anger. The most dangerous form of anger is a resentment. We know through research that people who hold grudges or have a chip on their shoulder or have anger that just festers and does not go away for long periods of time can result into depression, because that chronic level of emotional stress on the brain is going to be neurotoxic enough to lead to what we know can turn into a biological depression. People that are chronically dissatisfied and resentful and unhappy is because they don't know how to resolve their anger dealing with what is painful in life. When we are in stressful situations, we have to be able to face the fact that not everything is wonderful, and sometimes things are hard to face. Maybe I'm not doing so well at something, and I have to accept that. Maybe something is very painful, and I'm not talking about it, or I'm experiencing something that's very difficult, and I don't understand how it's impacting me. Let me give you an example of some of these. I'm afraid of snakes. I don't know why I'm afraid of snakes. I've never been bit by a snake or had a bad experience with a snake. But I do know when I was a young scout, I had a scout leader that pretty well convinced me that if I got bit by a snake, I had about 15 minutes to live if I didn't get some emergency care, or I took the knife and cut a big hole where the bite mark was and sucked the blood out so the poison wouldn't go to my heart. So you can imagine on a 50-mile hike in the Uintas, when I know I'm hours away from medical care, that I'm walking around hyper-vigilant of every trail looking at where the next snake is going to come and get me. I had the longest long jump on the Provo River Trail when I was jogging and looked down and there was a snake between my legs and I went about 15 feet. Now my kids know that I'm afraid of snakes, and my boys, when they were younger, took great joy in that fear. And when we moved next to this big field and we were building a house and I was putting in the trenches for the PVC for the sprinkler system, and they would go out into the field and they would find snakes. And they would put them in the trenches where I was going to come along and put the PVC pipe. Now you can imagine, as we are taught as young boys, when we come home crying and we say, Dad, I'm being picked on, Dad doesn't teach me to say, please don't pick on me, that hurts me. What does Dad tell me? Why don't you defend yourself? Why don't you fight back? Stand up for yourself. We are taught in this society how to fight against being hurt. So do you think I looked at my sons and said, please don't do that, it scares me, don't put snakes out here in the yard? No, I said, if I catch one more snake in these trenches, I'm going to kill both of you. Okay? So my anger was my defense mechanism against my fear of being hurt. And every one of us experience these emotions. If we're under chronic anxiety and we don't recognize that, can you see how your defensiveness is going to go up and you're going to start feeling irritable and ornery and angry and have a very difficult time dealing emotionally in your setting? So we have to be able to recognize what is going on with us and recognize what's happening to us at work and deal with some of the difficult things we're facing and deal with them openly and seek out the support system that we need. Now you can imagine that if we deal with this on a normal level, now imagine that the anxiety is being caused by a biological illness. There is no reason for me to be anxious because nothing really is there that's going to hurt me. My brain doesn't understand that. My brain is going to try to find a reason why I feel anxious. It must not be safe being with you folks right here. You might be judging me or thinking I don't know what I'm doing or talking about, and I don't like that. So I'm really feeling uncomfortable here, and it's teaching my brain it is not safe to be in front of people talking because they will judge you. So I start creating a belief system to explain away my anxiety. This is what people with anxiety disorders do. is they try to explain why they're having certain emotions. They don't stop and say, geez, maybe I'm having this anxiety because my serotonergic system isn't working well right now. That's not usually what people say to themselves, not until they get into a crisis and end up in professional care. We as healthcare professionals, as caregivers, no matter what role you're in, if you're a teacher, if you're a therapist, if you're an aide working in a care facility, you are going to deal with situations that become threatening to you. And that anxiety is going to cause you to protect yourself against. You're going to become a little bit fearful, but you're not necessarily going to recognize what's happening to you, and your brain is going to try to explain it. This is not a good place. I hate being here. And we're not going to respond and deal with those situations very effectively if we don't recognize what we are facing and why we're facing that. Okay? So self-awareness is extremely important as we understand these things. If we look at our mood, if we look at our defensiveness, if we look at our anger, if we look at where our attitude is at, and we start asking ourselves, maybe I'm dealing with some chronic anxiety from burnout, and it's a psychological syndrome of emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and reduced personal accomplishment. We hit the wall, and we just can't take it anymore. Unless you have the authority to fire me, don't come in, okay? Sometimes we just get to the point where we just want everybody to leave us alone. So dealing with compassion fatigue is when you take a different situation and you add it to burnout. So we've talked a little bit about what burnout is, affecting our attitude by not dealing with the chronic issues from day to day that causes stress. But compassion fatigue is when you take something else, a different phenomenon, and add it to burnout, and that is secondary traumatization. How many of you have heard of the term secondary or vicarious traumatization? We'll get to that in just a second so you understand it. But compassion fatigue is a more serious condition. It's a decline in physical health, having decreased energy, a chronic feeling of uncertainty and unhappiness. We start developing relationship conflicts and emotional instability, and we start demonstrating more problems with life management and unhealthy choices. Compassion fatigue is the convergence of primary traumatic stress, things that we experience directly, with secondary trauma stress and the cumulative stress of burnout when we're in this profession. Vicarious traumatization is when we're experiencing trauma through somebody else. If I'm constantly seeing people that are in pain for whatever reason, whether they're a cancer victim, whether they're a trauma victim from sexual abuse, whether they're chronically mentally ill and depressed and suicidal, whether they've been cutting on themselves or self-injuring, that constant pain, that violence, being in a work environment where my coworker is getting assaulted, experiencing that trauma is direct primary traumatization. Listening to the stories of trauma is vicarious traumatization. So we deal with both of those, and then we deal with a state of tension and preoccupation with the patient by re-experiencing the traumatic events and avoidance of the numbing and the persistence arousal that comes with that trauma. Before we take a break, let me just share with you a story that I experienced. Years ago, I was a nurse on the forensic unit, and we had a young man named Micah who was extremely suicidal and depressed. We had him in wrist-to-waist restraints for probably 6 months with a one-to-one staff member on him because we knew he was going to try anything in his power to hurt himself. This went on and on and on, and he was quite a whiner. He was bugging everybody. The psych techs that would be assigned to do his one-to-one were always complaining if they got assigned to him because he would just sit and cry and whine and want out of his restraints. And finally, I remember this psych tech, John, came up to me and says, I just can't take it anymore. So I went to Mike and I says, what's wrong? And he says, if you would just let me out of these restraints for a half an hour so I can stretch my arms and move around, I promise I'll quit whining tonight and I'll go to bed and go to sleep. So we sat down as a team and talked about it, and John, the psych tech, said, that's good with me because I'm sick of listening to him, so I'll stay right with him. I called the doctor and talked to the doctor about it, and the doctor said, okay, if you guys feel like you can watch him, go ahead. Micah had this very well planned out. In his room, he had discovered that when we had to do some retrofitting of a electrical system for the fire system that we had to put conduit on the outside of the ceiling, not inside the wall because of the old building, and that the contractor had run out of breakaway screws and had put a non-breakaway screw in the ceiling of his room as it went around the fire detector. And there was just enough space in that conduit and the fire detector that he knew he could slip something through there. Micah went into his room after we took the wrist-to-waist off, and John was just about 3 feet away from him, and he said to John, "Would you please turn around while I change and put my PJs on?" In just 5 seconds, Micah grabbed the sheet off of his bed, jumped up onto his dresser, and looped that through and wrapped it around his neck and fell and broke his neck. We worked on Micah for quite a while, but he didn't make it. When the police came and the ambulance came, for the next 5 hours, we were interrogated to make sure that this was a suicide and not foul play. So you can imagine the difficulties we were experiencing, and I was trying to deal with this traumatic event that took place. We had just lost this patient. You can imagine how the techs feel, especially John, who was just previously whining and complaining to me about how stressful it was to take care of Micah. And I thought I was doing pretty well until we had been there all night. We were the afternoon shift, so we actually stayed through till the next morning, and we were tired. And we walked into the staff meeting as the day shift staff walked in. And when they heard what happened, one of the day nurses said, "Who's the idiot that took him out of restraints?" I can promise you that that moment has been very vivid in my brain for 25 years. I got to a point over the next 6 months where I didn't want to go to work. I didn't want to take care of patients. I wanted to change my profession. I was depressed and sad and anxious. I didn't trust my clinical decisions. I couldn't even call a doctor to ask for an order. I wanted other nurses to do that for me. I had been impacted by the primary traumatization and burnout of that situation. And I was dealing with PTSD symptoms myself. Many of us get into those experiences. I needed professional help. And it wasn't until an administrator came up to me and said, "Dallas, I think something's wrong." And that's when I broke down and told him. In fact, my brother-in-law and his wife, not knowing anything about this story, named their daughter Micah a few months after that, and I was so ticked. And I got mad at them and said, "That's the stupidest name. Why did you choose that name?" Because I didn't want to be reminded of that name any longer. Every one of us is going to experience some kind of trauma when we work with the type of people we work with. And we may think that we're above and we're strong and these things don't impact us. But I can promise you, if we're not self-aware and we don't seek the help we need in getting through these difficult situations, the impact will lead to compassion fatigue, and we will be personally impacted as clinicians and professionals if we don't take care of ourselves. If we don't recognize what is happening to us in these difficult situations, it will have a severe detriment onto us personally. We have to recognize our strengths and our limitations, but also the realities of this work. We're going to take a 10-minute break, let you get up and move around, and then we'll come back and begin talking about what we deal with and how we treat compassion fatigue. So just let me clarify, there's a little bit difference between vicarious traumatization and secondary traumatization. Vicarious traumatization is when you're actually listening to the stories but not experiencing the trauma itself. So many times people who work with trauma victims can experience vicarious traumatization. Secondary traumatization is when you see or experience somebody else get traumatized. So I see a coworker get assaulted. I'm not the one that got assaulted, but it affects me similarly, and I can still develop PTSD symptoms from secondary traumatization. So who's at risk? Well, there's a lot of us that are at risk all the time, but the ones that are most risk, so if you're in an organization, who do we look out for the most? It's the new employees, the youngest ones who really don't know what they're going through, that don't understand what to do. So those of us that are more senior need to really pay attention to how people are going through different issues and train them in this stuff so we can help and nurture them along. People who are super caring and empathetic and get really engaged and enmeshed with different individuals can be at risk. And it doesn't mean that that's a bad thing to be caring and empathetic, but when you're just overly empathetic with everything, you become susceptible to this. Or if you become more overly involved, or if you work in an emotionally charged setting, and I think all of us probably know what that is, we've been in those before. If we have unresolved personal issues, if you know that a coworker is going through a real difficult time in their life, maybe they're in therapy themselves, or they have been treated for a mental illness and they're coming to work and struggling, or have difficulties with panic attacks, or maybe they're going through a divorce, or maybe there's been some crisis, death in their family. So anybody that's been through something very personal that's still unresolved makes them more vulnerable. Least trained or supervised, so people that just are not very experienced can be very susceptible to this because they just don't clinically understand what may be happening to them. People who don't take care of themselves live a very sedentary lifestyle, don't eat well, don't exercise, don't get good sleep. These are people that are more susceptible. And then trauma workers. We used to go out, and I know that we'd go out to first responders and do a lot of this training. I know that most police departments and fire departments actually require that their employees meet with a counselor once a year just to have a reassessment done so they can determine how they're dealing with the constant trauma that they face on a regular basis. Also, one thing that's not listed here is people in private practice are also more susceptible because they don't typically have a connection with their colleagues that they can meet with and bounce things off of and do clinical supervision or have somebody that's a support system to them. So private therapists sometimes can be more susceptible. The risk factors are also two different kinds, and this is a little bit complicated, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Predisposing risk factors are those where people who internalize stressful experiences, lack of family support, and stress, and have a stressful life event happening. So you're already predisposed to how you respond to stress because of the way you deal with it, and you don't have good coping strategies in your personal life. Or a perpetuating situation where you perceive an event in a very negative way, more so than maybe it impacts other people around you. So perceptually, you tend to view things negatively, and you interpret those based on your own beliefs and values. If you have a hard time trusting people, or you're very guarded with your emotions, you don't typically share how you're feeling with other people, these are character traits that you have could cause you to be more at risk. Protective factors are very important too, things that you should be aware of that can help you in coping and dealing with some of these things. A good life balance. Now, I know that this is the last thing that we all like to hear about, right? Is you got to take care of yourself. Every one of us hears this all the time. Eat right, go to the gym, develop an exercise program, get balanced, you got to work and play. And it is so hard in the hustle and bustle of life to be consistent with these things. So I'm the worst example of consistency when it comes to a balanced lifestyle. And it's something that we have to constantly remind ourselves of and be talking about with other people and talking with other professionals and having a good support system in your family and at work. You should be talking about how are we as workers, employees, as an organization, dealing with the stress that we experience within our environment. That is something we talk about a lot at the state hospital. Safety becomes a priority for us every day, but we're also looking at how are we responding. I sit down with my administrative team often and talk about what are we doing to take care of ourselves. Are we taking time out? Let's just get away and go talk for an hour and check in with each other. If we know somebody's struggling, are we reaching out to that person? Are we checking in with them? Some of the symptoms of compassion fatigue that are more serious are emotional exhaustion, when you feel extremely drained and tired. You lack productivity, you become frustrated and become cynical. You have a decreased ability to feel joy. If you start developing symptoms of depression and you just can't enjoy anything like going out to a family dinner or spending time with the kids, or just you went someplace to, you just don't want to go out to a movie because you don't want to go out to the house and get away and do things. If you find yourself just not motivated to have fun and you just feel trapped in this dark place, then you probably should ask yourself, how am I responding? Is this a possibility that I'm dealing with a clinical issue that needs professional assistance? The emotional residual of the exposure, you just can't get over it. Some people will say that as their way of explaining it. This thing just keeps bugging me. I can't get it off my mind. And I start acting out. I just start doing things that aren't normally me. What's wrong? Somebody might say to you. That's not your typical self. I've never seen you get mad like that before. How come, you just slammed your door? That's different. Wow, what's going on with them, So if you see things where somebody starts acting out behaviorally that's just different, or you might say, oh my gosh, something's not right, that's not me, then you probably ought to take a step back and say, okay, what's going on with me? Or if somebody else makes a comment, rather than get defensive and try to deny that anything's wrong, take a step back and say, okay, maybe something is not right, and I'm just not dealing with things very well in my life right now. And when you start becoming emotionally detached from everything, and you just don't want to experience anything, you don't want to be around people, if somebody starts telling you about something that they're struggling with, and you can sense yourself just not wanting to listen, and I just okay, and you just get distracted and want to be gone from that moment, then you just have to ask yourself, okay, I'm not doing well right now. These symptoms match the same categories as post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's what's important to understand as you are experiencing a mild PTSD. The arousal, the hypervigilance, sleep disturbances, the startle response, the low frustration tolerance, difficulty concentrating, these are all under the arousal symptom of PTSD. The intrusion, the recurring thoughts or images of clients, nightmares. And it's amazing, I had a tech that experienced a hanging of a suicide. And I remember he was about 15 years later, he talked to me and said he was having difficulty sleeping. And when it finally came down to it, it was because whenever he would fall asleep, he would have a dream that he woke up and this particular individual was hanging over his bed. And so he was afraid to fall asleep. And this went on for 15 years, and he was not getting any help for it. Avoidance, minimizing patient stories, silencing and avoiding, because you've got other clients to take care of, and if we're not dealing well because we've been impacted by something, we become extremely ineffective at being clinically helpful to other people or working with other people. If one kid has worn you out and you're extremely tired and frustrated and burned out, you are not going to be very effective with the other kids that you're responsible for if you work in a setting like that. Depression, the sadness, the dissociative feelings, trying to get away from work. We won't get into transference, countertransfer, and some of you who are clinicians would understand that. But you see the world in terms of victims and perpetrators. Everything starts getting skewed. People are going to take advantage. People are going to hurt me. I'm always guarded and on the defense of emotional pain. I don't want to feel anything any longer, so I start disengaging and trying to get away from everything. Welcome aboard, and if you have any problems at all, don't hesitate to shut up. Sometimes people that are over us or organizationally, our supervisors or people within the organization that we work with can't deal with this. And if they're dealing with stuff, it's just like, we don't want to talk about that. And you'll notice people who are supposed to be in situations where they're trying to help the organization function better, but they're dealing with their own burnout and their own frustrations or compassion fatigue, if they've gone through something more serious, become extremely ineffective. There's different phases that we go through with compassion fatigue that's important to understand. The first phase of the compassion fatigue is just that idealistic phase. I'm going to save the world. I got into this profession to help people, to train people, to treat people, to teach people, and I'm going to be the best there is, and I'm going to save everybody. And I'm ready to serve, and I'm going to fix every problem. And boy, it's so fun to get new people in your organization because they come in with great ideas, and they've got the newest information and research, and they've got the newest methodologies, and they're just gung-ho, and they just want to, motivate the whole organization. And you'll notice that people that have been there for 20, 25 years are just like, get this person out of my face. They're driving me crazy. I don't have the energy for this. Let them go take that project. I don't want to do it. I'm tired. Let them handle it. They seem to be excited about it. And so you can see how this evolves over time. If we're always volunteering to assist and help other people, and they're just full of energy and enthusiasm, and then we get to phase 2. We've started to experience stress in the workplace, and then all of a sudden that dream we had starts getting a little disillusioned, and we start cutting corners. We start avoiding talking to people and our patients, and we start to mock other people, and we start becoming very judgmental towards the people we're working with. We become very sarcastic and start calling our patients by labels and names. They're just manipulative. They're staff shopping. They're demanding. I can't stand it. We need to put more consequences on them. We need to become more punitive. And you start seeing this reaction in the culture of where you work. There needs to be more rules. People are getting away with stuff here they shouldn't be getting away with. And you can see these people just responding. We had this one guy that we called the Bullet. Because, boy, if anybody started getting a little bit ramped up or aggressive, he was right there and put him down on the floor and tied him up. And, boy, some of the staff loved having the Bullet around because, boy, everything got taken care of really quick. But it was a very unhealthy part of the environment. We start denigrating our own efforts of wellness. We start questioning whether we're really effective, and we start not trusting ourselves, and we lose our focus. Then we hit the third phase, which starts becoming a little bit more clinical. We're withdrawn. We lose patience with other people. We can't deal. Our tolerance level is low. We become easily defensive, and we start neglecting ourselves and others and become chronically fatigued, and we just start losing hope. We just don't see that there's much impact we can have, and nothing I do helps anyway, so I'm just going to go do my job and get my paycheck every 2 weeks and hope that the next 5 years goes by fast so I can retire. And you start getting into that mode of thinking, you're in trouble. We view oneself as a victim. The system sucks. Nobody cares about you, so why should I care? You start saying stuff like that in your head, you need to back up because you're starting to become a problem. And then you hit the zombie phase. This is when you don't care about nothing. Somebody shows up, you're like, Earth is full, could you please leave? I don't need you here in my life. We view others as incompetent. Nobody's able to help. Why should I try? We lose our humor and zest for life, and we just don't like anybody. We don't want to be around anybody. And we become easily enraged and angry at our system. These are the people that are chronically unhappy. The fifth phase is the real pathological phase, and this is the point when we hit our bottom. And every once in a while, you'll see somebody in our professions who you just look at and say, why don't you just retire? You're so unhappy, your life's miserable, get out of here. And they have a choice to make. They get to either stay sick and not change, or they can turn and get a renewal phase of their life and either get help and turn things around, or they actually leave and go find something else to do in their life. But you have to make a decision. You have to know what your limitations are, and you have to be able to take care of yourself. So we can change. We don't have to stay doing what we're doing, but we have to do what's best for us in our life. And if staying where we're at is not going to be a good thing, then we need to get out. Okay, so sometimes those are hard decisions to make. let's talk about the healing process, because health professionals are susceptible to impairment and burnout that may negatively affect clinical work. It is ethically imperative that we engage in self-care. Now, every one of you, ask yourself, if you are a licensed professional in this room, we have an ethical responsibility to put ourselves in the best place we can to be a clinically effective professional. This is not just about, oh, by the way, it's an afterthought that I'm going to take care of myself. My work's my primary focus. Self-care as a healthcare worker and as a caregiver is just as critical to the process as any aspect of training and caregiving to make ourselves effective, or we are going to experience negative consequences. Our attitude towards wellness in our own personal lives will be reflected in our approach and care for our patients. If you are not taking care of yourself and you're not well balanced and you don't have a healthy lifestyle, I can promise you the effectiveness that you have towards the people you are caring for is not where you could get to your potential. You could do a lot better. But wellness is much more than just a fitness program. I'm not really good at fitness programs. I'm not very athletic. So I had to sort of change that perception of the demands and resources for myself to look at it a little bit differently. It's a way of life. It's actually a perspective on achieving satisfaction. We have to look at our attitude and say, what is it truly that I believe will make me happy and that I find satisfaction in? If I'm worried about how much money I'm making hourly, I can promise you that I'm not going to fully feel satisfied when I go to work and go home. We have to be content with our role and our purpose. If I'm always looking up in the organization saying, I'm the guy at this level of the rung and I'm just not that important, then I'm going to have a hard time dealing with my level of satisfaction. I have to recognize that whatever I'm doing in the here and now has an important value. Maybe it's not where I want to end up in my life and I want to do more, but I can't keep looking at the what ifs and how comes and the what nots if I'm going to try to achieve satisfaction. It's a mindfulness and a better understanding of ourselves. Sometimes people will refer to that as our spirituality, but it's how we view the value that we have as an individual. And if I'm struggling with that, if I don't feel like me as an individual has any real purpose or value in what I'm doing, then I'm going to struggle with this. It's also a strong sense of gratitude. Someone once said, what if I wake up in the morning and all I have in my possession is that which I thank God for the night before? How much would you have in your possession this morning? How many of us have an attitude of gratitude every day, that we're thankful, even if we're in a really, really bad place, trying to change that perception and say, you know what, it's not all black and white, because it's very easy to think everything sucks when I'm in pain. Nothing's good. Nothing's worthy. I'm not grateful for anything. My son, who's now 31, when he was just about 4 years old, was throwing a tantrum because he wasn't getting his way, and he was a moody kid anyway. And my wife and I thought, maybe if we just get him to kneel down and just say a prayer, maybe, his mind will refocus and he'll think of something he's grateful for. We said, just think of something you're grateful for and just kneel down and think about positive things. And this little kid kneeled down, and my wife and I were sitting there, and he sat there for a minute, and he goes, God, thanks for nothing, amen. We were biting our lips because we were trying not to laugh, but I looked at my wife and I said, that didn't work. But sometimes we have to stop and really think about what are we really truly grateful for. Wellness is also an attitude of responsibility and accountability. We have to take responsibility for our happiness and our own emotional stability. We cannot look towards our organization, our supervisor, anywhere else outside of ourselves for the responsibility of whether or not I'm content and happy and satisfied in my job. because it is so easy to blame administration or to blame the organization for my unhappiness. It is so common when people have poor morale to look outside themselves and blame all the mistakes of everybody else around you for why my job sucks. We have to take the responsibility. It's my life. If I'm going to go to work and be happy, I'm not going to wait and depend on my boss to tell me how good I am or to thank me for what a great job I did this year or anything like that. I'm not going to make that dependent on my happiness, because then I'm not taking that accountability and that responsibility. Now, there may be some difficult things at work that are making me frustrated and stressed, but I have to face those things and take accountability for them and to address those and go talk to people about those and work through those in an appropriate way so that it's not just me ignoring that responsibility and griping and complaining about everything that's wrong around me. It helps me to develop emotional stability and understand of one's strengths and limitations. I have to be able to know what I can and can't do to be okay. And it's a healthy balance in life amidst the demands and challenges. I have to know when to set limits on how much I can do. And sometimes we feel like we can't say no in our work environment because we've been told we have to do stuff. You know, we're short-staffed, we're doing the work of 2 or 3 people, and that's really hard. But I have to know when I'm getting so exhausted and burned out, it's time for me to take a vacation day. And there's some people that are so worried about their finances, they're volunteering for every overtime shift there is in the week. They're working themselves to death, they're studying, they're in school. And students often get burned out and get stressed out. And so sometimes those are the natural consequences of the lifestyle we choose. But we have to know throughout life as professionals and as caregivers, what are my limitations and when am I hitting the wall and when do I need to stop and take care of myself? And it's also a physical health issue. So we do have to pay attention to our physical health and take care of those things. Where do we begin? We have to reevaluate how we work. I had a private clinician who came to me in my private practice to see me because he had felt like he had reached this burnout stage in his own life and wasn't managing well, and he was experiencing job dissatisfaction. He hated to see clients. He was getting resentful that he was so busy. He wasn't taking time off. He was booked out 3 or 4 months, and yet he wasn't saying no to new clients, so he started extending his work days to 7, 8 o'clock at night. He didn't know how to draw those limits for himself, and he came in and he was just wiped out and anxious and depressed and not sleeping well and physically just not feeling good. And our whole focus became, how do you reevaluate how smart you're working? You have to learn how to set those boundaries and limits for yourself so you know you can't do everything for everybody. You can't take care of all the problems in the world around you. We have to periodically assess our goals and our passions and look at that wellness plan. And we have to build a professional support system. No matter what role you're in, even if you're not a licensed clinician, you work with coworkers and you need to have a support system around you. And there needs to be, for you administrators, having supervisory groups that you can sit down with people and actually allow people to process how they're doing in their work situation. And also make sure you're taking time off for yourself. A lot of us don't do that very well because we think because of financial limitations or our work situation we can't. It's not all about an expensive vacation just to get away. Not too long ago, I was feeling a little bit tired and worn out and just couldn't focus. I was sitting at my desk and I'm just like, I gotta do something. And so the next day, I just decided to take half the day off. It wasn't a full day. I had a lot to do. But I went home, and the next day I came back, and my secretary said, what did you do on your day off? You know, because a lot of people, they got to do something. And I said, I did absolutely nothing. I just went home and sat on the couch and watched a movie and read and just sat there. And just for that 3 or 4 hours was just all I needed. Just to get over that, just had to clear my mind. Sometimes it just takes something simple like that. But if we don't stop and take some of those moments, and sometimes we don't have the ability to because we're not in charge of our schedules at work, but we have to be aware of that and try to take advantage of our free time. Treating compassion fatigue is about relationships. It's about learning relaxation skills, and it's about the narrative. Sometimes we may not really know how to identify what we're going through, and so I would encourage you to sit down and write it out. If you're frustrated at work, if you're dealing with a challenge at work, if you're struggling with an incident that's happened in your life, if you're just overwhelmed and not doing well, sit down and just start writing about what you're feeling. Because when you put it right out in front of yourself and do the narrative, you will start identifying things that you're not really being self-aware of. How many of you teach relaxation skills? About half of you? How many of you do relaxation skills? About a third of you. How many of you do deep breathing? Okay, and I don't mean just sigh when you're frustrated. But there's actually some really cool, very simple things you can do and some tricks to deep breathing that I've been taught over the years that I think are pretty interesting. So just for a second, we're going to do one of them really quick because we're sort of short on time, but I want you to just walk through this with me real quick. I'm going to see how good you really are at deep breathing, and then I'm going to teach you a little trick that helps you to actually get your body to slow down. Every one of you know how to deep breathe, right? What is the trick to deep breathing? What is it? In through your nose, out through your mouth, okay? It's not, it's, you blow out through pursed lips. Because all you're trying to do is open up those alveolar sacs in your lungs to get more oxygen into your bloodstream, because that's going to lower your metabolic rate and send signals to your brain that you can start relaxing because you got enough oxygen in your system and your heart rate's going to start going down. Okay, so I want everybody, just take a few deep breaths through your nose, purse your lips and out through your mouth and relax. Anybody that falls asleep will know that you're dealing with burnout and you probably need a nap. So just, I know it's hard to relax with 100 people in the room, but I'm going to teach you this is doable. Do that for just a few seconds. It doesn't take long to get to that point. Now, I want you to, as you continue doing that, not loud breaths, but just small breaths that go in, about medium breaths, let them out. I want you to focus and ground yourself. Everybody here has probably done grounding techniques who've done relaxation. I want you to focus on the sounds you can hear in the room. Now, the final grounding technique that most people don't do is called using your peripheral vision. When you're grounding into the sound, and most of you can probably hear the air circulating through the ventilation system, you're going to take your vision and you're going to look straight forward, and then you're going to focus on the furthest thing you can see on this side and the furthest thing you can see on this side. And you're going to do your deep breathing. Keep your eyes straight forward and focus on your peripheral vision as you're deep breathing and focusing on the sound. What most of us don't realize is our brains, when it's in that fight or flight state, our vision becomes very myopic, and it wants to look at that fight or flight. What's the immediate threat to me? When you look at your peripheral vision, you trick your brain into believing it doesn't need to be myopic, and it tells the brain you do not have to be in the fight or flight mode any longer. And you'll notice your heart rate will start to drop immediately and your blood pressure will start coming down slightly, and you'll actually feel something. Now, this is like anything else. You have to practice it. You have to train your brain. It's gotten to the point now where I do this on a daily basis. I don't use my peripheral vision all the time because sometimes I'll do it when I'm driving, and that's not very safe. But you can actually train your brain that as soon as you start this process, you'll actually feel a sensation go through your body here that is a relaxation. And that relaxation feeling is actually your blood vessels constricting and dilating, and it's the blood moving through your system that gives you that physical sensation. If you don't feel that sensation, then you need to practice more. So I would encourage you to do this at least a couple of times a day for 5 minutes, and do it every day until you actually can feel that sensation of relaxation hit you. It's a physical feeling. It's not a cognitive, I feel relaxed feeling. It's actually a physical, I'm slowing down. And you'll actually notice that you're more attentive to physical pain that you have in your body. Oh, I'm starting to notice my back hurts, or I got a headache, because you're becoming more self-aware, and that will start helping you to become sensitive to where you're at personally. When the pain of staying the same is greater than the fear of change, this is when we start changing. Most of us don't do anything about it until we hit that bottom. I'm going to go through these things sort of quickly. You have these in your handouts. I don't think they're rocket science, but there's a few things on here that you need to be aware of. I always tell people, to take a chill pill if you're getting too stressed out about things, and don't worry about the paperwork. You can either do it tomorrow, or the guy that takes your job after you get fired will take care of it for you. So don't worry about the small things in life. But we have to live healthy, exercise, and learn to rest and relax and have fun and spend time with ourselves and the people around us. We have to be self-managed. We have to take accountability for this. If you don't feel any accountability to take care of yourself after hearing this discussion, then you probably missed the point of what we're trying to get at. It's not just about recognizing burnout and compassion fatigue symptoms. It's actually understanding, I have to do something about it. This is not the responsibility of others around me. We have to develop the ability to work through the cognitive perceptions in our head and our attitudes, and get rid of those perfectionistic thoughts. If I'm not here, I'm no good, I'm a failure. Many of you have that probably. It's bred into us sometimes in the families we're raised in because of the types of criticism we take. You're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're not skilled enough, you're not talented enough. We got to get rid of those things. Every one of us at some point in time will compare ourselves to somebody else. That we all know that's detrimental to us, and we have to renounce that. And the other thing is we have to develop a non-reactivity to the emotions of other people. How many of you get anxious when somebody's angry in your environment around you? It makes you tense. We all sort of feel that defensiveness come up. That's that fear factor, because we're afraid that something's going to hurt us. We have to learn that we got to step back and say, you know what, this is my perception of the situation, and I'm taking too much ownership here of other people's emotions, and I'm reacting to them. How do I learn not to react when other people are emotionally charged, and to step back and say, this is not my responsibility. Now, it doesn't mean I don't need to help this person or engage myself with them, but I need to look at how am I reacting in circumstances that might be causing me more stress. Develop awareness, become educated about compassion fatigue. One of the things we did at the state hospital is we created a training video that I share with my staff, and we have an icon on everybody's computer that's a self-assessment tool. So at any given time, any employee can pull that up and answer a bunch of questions, and it will give them a score based on how they're responding to stress. And it could be that, your stress level's a little bit higher, your burnout level's a little bit higher, you need to do the following things, and then it will link them to some resources to help them. The higher their score goes, then it turns into more, you might need professional assistance however you're doing at this moment. And then we bring in a therapist twice a month to the state hospital, and the employees can go in and actually schedule an appointment. It's like an EAP program, but we do it, we sponsor it at the hospital. And the employees can actually schedule an appointment with a private counselor, and they have an office on campus. And it's an anonymous process. I don't know any of the employees that have gone to see her. She's a wonderful lady. She works with Blomquist Hell. It's an organization in Orem, also statewide. But we offer that to our employees because we know people need professional help that work in our system. Just because we're professionals doesn't mean we're immune to needing professional counseling. So we allow our staff to have access right on campus. And then we created a comfort room on the campus. And the comfort room is somewhere where if a staff member's just having a really tough day, they just experienced something tough or traumatic, or they're just burned out and tired, they can go and ask their boss for some time out. And the staff can go to the comfort room, and there's snacks, there's a couch, there's some music, there's a couple of massage chairs they can sit in and have a massage if they want for 10 minutes. There's a little waterfall thing, they can turn on the music, and it's just a time for staff to do some relaxation. Those are things organizations need to look at to take care of each other as employees. And our staff love it. We're going to start building comfort rooms in all of our buildings for staff. We have comfort rooms for patients to take time out in, but we never developed comfort rooms for professionals. And this is something that professional organizations need to start really looking at. If we really truly want to take it seriously that our employees matter, we need to take care of them, and we need to give them that professional assistance they need. We also need to connect with others, do volunteer work, join support groups, and we need to be intentional about what we're doing. Don't be reactive to everything that happens to you in life. Take charge and take this stuff seriously. Don't get caught up into the triangulations of your environment, the gossiping, the dysfunctional relationships around you. Stand back and view these problems as challenges and opportunities that we can all develop an opportunity for growth. We are responsible for our own positive morale. We need to look at this and just say, listen, tell me how lucky I am to work here. I keep forgetting. We have to keep reminding ourselves that we are very fortunate, we are very blessed to have the opportunities that we have in these professions. Finally, we can find fulfillment in helping others deal with adversity and suffering. These moments of healing and hope counter disillusionment and fatigue and help us to celebrate our contributions to humanity. If we take care of ourselves, this work becomes so much more gratifying. If we don't take care of ourselves and recognize that these things will impact us, we are not going to be immune from the impact of the type of work we do. Until we understand that and become aware of ourselves and take responsibility for these types of issues in our lives, we are going to go through periods of time that are extremely dissatisfying, can be pathological, and be very detrimental to us personally, to our families, and professionally. And we have to learn to take care of ourselves and take these things seriously. Every one of us is impacted by the type of work we do because of the nature of what we do. All of you here in this room and myself, these are things that we're just going to have to face. And we are ethically responsible to address these things. So that ends the part of the presentation on compassion fatigue. So I just wanted to open up for questions before we go into the psychopharmacology update. Any questions or comments? The relaxation exercise was just too overwhelming for you, I think. I think I might have just put you all to sleep for the morning. Okay, well, the slides are available, I think, on the Scenic View website. You can access the information there if you want to print those off and put those with your notes. Okay, we just have a little bit of time left. I was asked if I would give a little bit of an update on psychopharmacology and what is happening in the field of medicine. Those of you who aren't interested in this part, you're welcome to step out, or if you're interested, you can stay and listen to this part. Over the past 30 years, we've seen a significant advancement in the availability of new psychotropic medications, antidepressants, antipsychotics, mood-stabilizing agents. The brain is a very complex organ in the body. I think every one of us are totally fine if we're sick from here down. Well, we're not fine, but we can accept it better. But if we're sick from the chin up, we tend to have a problem with that. It doesn't make sense. We don't want it. We fear it. We just don't know how to deal with it. As you can see here, the outer part of the brain is the cortex on the left. That is our gray matter. That is where we do a lot of our thinking and our judgment, our muscle movements. We have different lobes in the brain that have different responsibilities. When any parts of the brain are impacted by any kind of dysfunctional process, whether it's an abnormality in the development of the brain or whether it's a biochemical process of the brain, we can see problems develop that result in different types of diseases. There are over 100 billion nerve cells in the brain. I have no idea who sat down and counted them. but somebody tells us that's how many there is. The history of psychotropic medications is basically after World War II, the study of antihistamines gave us a lot of knowledge about the brain when we started to understand that there was actually receptors in the brain and neurochemicals that could impact or block those receptors from certain mechanisms. In 1948 in Australia, lithium was being used to treat a condition called gout, epilepsy, and cancer. But they also found that it actually had some mood stabilizing properties, and now we use it as the gold standard for people with bipolar illness and as also as an augmentation for antidepressants. In the 1950s, our first antipsychotics came out, our phenothiazine, such as Thorazine. Before this time, most people just went to institutions to be housed there. The history of mental health with state hospitals was the only place that people would go to for mental health treatment. The state hospital in Utah was opened up in 1885 before the state of Utah was even a state. It was called the Utah Territorial Insane Asylum. People that had mental illness, and we didn't really understand it back then, were committed to state institutions because that was the only place you could go to get any kind of mental health treatment. And most of these places became inundated with individuals who were not going anywhere. They pretty much were spending their entire lives in these institutions until we were able to, the advent of medications came out and people actually were starting to be treated for these illnesses, and we started seeing people enter into a phase of recovery. In 1958, Haldol was introduced into our system, and we started using it as well. Also in the 1950s, the tricyclic antidepressants came out. Other types of antidepressants called MAOIs were developed. And other typical antipsychotics, such as the perfenazine, which is Prolixin, and others came out. When I started as a nurse at the state hospital, we basically had a medicine called Navaine, Thorazine, and Haldol. And those were basically all we had to use as far as treating anybody with a psychotic disorder. In the 80s, we started to develop other types of antidepressants. Prozac was first approved as a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. It was one of the most safe and used medications by the World Health Organization to treat depression. Also, later at that time, a new medication called Clozaril was developed. In 1952 it was developed, but it actually didn't become available for use for a number of years later because of its cost and availability, and also it had some very serious side effects. In the 1990s, though, this was the decade of the brain when we started to really understand neurotransmitters and receptors in the brain functioning. And we saw an explosion of antipsychotics that started to come out that really not only treated the positive symptoms of hallucinations with psychosis, but also the cognitive and negative symptoms, the affective symptoms, the depression, and the cognitive symptoms that went along with psychotic disorders. So medications like Risperdal and Zyprexa, Geodon, Seroquel, these medications came out in the 90s. There was other medications that were on the market earlier than that. Valium and Librium were used to treat detox for alcoholism. We started using those in the 70s for anxiety disorders, and they were called anxiolytics, and they were the benzodiazepines. Most of you might know them as Ativan or Xanax, Valium. These were what treated anxiety, but they were very addictive medications, and so there was a lot of scrutiny of their use. Also, back in the 50s is when our medications for attention deficit came out. Ritalin in 1955 was introduced, and it had a reuptake inhibition of dopamine, and we'll talk about what that means in just a second real quickly. In the 90s, though, we started to see some new medications for ADHD, Adderall, amphetamine salts, which increases the norepinephrine and dopamine activity of the brain. In 1960s, seizure medications started to be seen as also mood stabilizing agents. So people that were on medications for seizures, we started seeing benefits. Tegretol, Depakote were some of the more common ones, and they affected the GABA levels of the brain. And I won't get into the neurobiology and the pharmacokinetics of this because I don't know that we really have prescribers here in the room, so I'm just trying to give an overview of medications rather than how they work. In the 90s, we saw new mood stabilizing agents that came out, Lamictal. It was structurally different, but it still increased the GABA activity. In the brain, that cortex, the big part of the brain, has two main systems. There's a glutamate system, which is the excitatory system, and the GABA system, which is the inhibitory system. Anything that stimulates GABA calms us down. Anything that stimulates glutamate gets us excited. Those two systems are what work together to create brain waves when you look at an EEG. What happens to those systems, though, because there's so many millions of nerve cells in those systems that have so many different functions that they have to be regulated somehow. There's a system that comes up through the midbrain that regulates the GABA and the glutamate system, and that's the serotonin, the dopamine, and the norepinephrine system. How many of you remember the old VHS recorders, the videotapes? Do you remember that sometimes when you're watching a movie, the top of the movie was on the bottom of the screen and the bottom of the movie was on the top of the screen? What did you have to do to fix that? There was a tracking button on the VCR, and you'd have to turn that and make the picture right on the screen. Okay, some of you weren't born when we did that. But that's what the serotonin and the dopamine systems do in your emotional brain, is they communicate with the cognitive upper brain, and they get the glutamate and the GABA systems working together. So they're your tracking button to make everything work right. Okay? We're going to skip over that, but these dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine neurotransmitters have different functions. So you can see how they overlap a little bit. The neurochemical in the brain called norepinephrine deals with energy, alertness, concentration, impulse, anxiety, irritability, mood regulation, and attention. But you can also see that dopamine and serotonin have some of those same effects. So it becomes sort of a strategic artistic ability to look at different medications and understand which one am I going to use for this individual based on the different types of symptoms they might be having, because there's no test for me to go in and determine what part of your brain isn't working. Is it serotonergic systems by your hypothalamus, by your amygdala, by your pituitary glands, all these other parts of your midbrain, your limbic system, which controls your emotions? I don't know how to test that. But we have theories and we have research that shows us how these medications work and how they might go in and improve the dysfunctional capabilities your brain might have in dealing with these things. For example, low serotonin levels are linked to depression. It's an important neurotransmitter in the human body, and it's believed to help regulate our mood, our social behavior, our appetite and digestion, our sleep, our memory, and our sexual desire and function. So if I'm having a problem with my serotonergic system, you can see that a major part of my life is going to be disrupted, and I'm going to be having difficulties. Dopamine also allows us to have feelings of bliss and pleasure, euphoria, drive, and motivation, focus and concentration. When dopamine levels are depleted in the brain, the nerve impulses or messages cannot be transmitted properly and can impair the brain functions, creating problems with behavior, mood, our cognitive thinking patterns, our attention and learning, our movement, and our sleep. Dopamine deficiencies can result in lack of interest in life, decreased motivation, procrastination, inability to feel pleasure, altered sleep patterns, restless leg syndrome, fatigue, mood swings, excessive feelings of hopelessness and guilt, poor memory, inability to focus, impulse and self-destructive behaviors, addictions to caffeine and other stimulants, and weight gain. Now, some of you just sat here and said, I think I have a dopamine deficiency, right? Extreme dopamine deficiencies can actually lead to Parkinson's disease. And this is how we actually found some of our medications, because when they gave people who had Parkinson's L-Dopa, which was a dopamine substance, if you gave them too much, they would develop a psychotic disorder. And so we realized that too much dopamine actually in certain parts of the brain would create hallucinations and other disturbances in thinking. So our drugs became developed to increase or reduce the effect of these neurotransmitters. So that's what we were looking at in developing these medications, is how do we regulate serotonergic levels, dopamine levels, norepinephrine levels, so that the GABA and the glutamate system will work effectively as well. So we were able to develop these to treat neurological disorders, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, and Parkinson's disease. You can see here by this picture of the brain the different functions. that are in these pathways. Dopamine pathways communicate through the midbrain and then go out to parts of the cortex, as well as the serotonergic pathways. And each one of these pathways have different functions on how we operate each day. You've all heard of the names of these medications being selective reuptake inhibitors or receptor blockers, and people say, well, what does that really mean? Our nerves are made up of electrical impulses. I think many of you have studied this in school. And at the end of each nerve, these nerves don't typically touch. They actually end in a place called a synapse, which is a fluid type of space. And each presynaptic nerve ending contains these neurotransmitters that is similar to a key that is released from the first nerve, and then it goes to the second nerve and finds a receptor which that key or neurotransmitter will affect or fit into, which then triggers the next nerve to fire or operate. These processes are happening in milliseconds on a very grand scale. When we have a deficiency of these nerves or neurotransmitters, then we don't get enough of the neurotransmitter to make the next nerve fire right. And so our blocking agents do two things. They can either block the receptor of the receiving nerve, or they can block the previous nerve from restoring or taking back that neurotransmitter. So we have this ability in our brain to have enzymes go out and get these proteins and bring them back to the first nerve so I can use it later. I'm always reprocessing those neurotransmitters. If I block the reuptake of that neurotransmitter, then that's going to sit out there in that synapse for longer periods of time and have a greater chance to trigger the next nerve. So I'm not actually giving you a pill that has serotonin in it. I'm actually giving you a medication that works on the process so the brain has a chance to adapt over time. This is why it's frustrating with for people with mental illness, is sometimes it takes 2 or 3 weeks to actually start stabilizing and feeling the effect of this balance process from happening. Some medications, though, are very fast-acting. They go right in and block the receptor and cause an immediate effect. For example, if you take a benzodiazepine like Xanax or Valium or Ativan, it goes directly to the GABA receptors and causes this extreme fast marination of the brain of GABA, which then calms your brain very quickly. So within 15 minutes, I feel calm because I took that pill. But then my GABA receptors start to adapt to needing that benzodiazepine to secrete GABA, and I can't calm down now after a while unless I get that medication to make me work. I get a little bit lazy. Some of the common antidepressants, I think you've all heard of these, the SSRIs, the reuptake of serotonin, the Prozac, Zoloft, Celexa, Lexapro, these are common names. I'm sure you've all heard of them. These have been around for a while. If it says SNRI, it's blocking the reuptake of norepinephrine. So there's different parts of the brain that these different systems work in. We don't know necessarily how to test the brain to determine if this person's dealing with depression and anxiety. It is a problem with the serotonergic system. Is it a problem with their dopamine system? Is it a problem with the norepinephrine system? So it becomes a trial and error process when we do medications. But what we do know from research is that about 60 to 70% of people will respond to an SSRI, where only 40 to 50% respond to an SNRI. So we know that the majority of people have more of a serotonergic problem, so we're going to start with the SSRIs first, and there's an algorithm we use to determine how we go through that process. There's antipsychotics that block the dopamine receptors so that you don't get that high dopamine activity and cause hallucinations. Some of these medications that your patients will be on will also be on them for mood stabilizing properties as well. Seroquel, Risperdal, Zyprexa, I mentioned those before. And then the benzodiazepines, we've talked about those. And then there's sleeping medications that are called hypnotics that people use, like Ambien, Lunesta, Sonata. And then the mood stabilizers that have been around for a while, a lot of your patients will be on these, are lithium and Depakote, Trileptal, Tegretol, Topamax, Lamictal, and Gabapentin are the most common ones. The most common stimulants that we've used over the past few years are Ritalin, Focalin, which is a type of Ritalin, and Dexedrine, Adderall, and Desoxyn. But we have some ongoing advancements in psychiatric medication treatment. There's a lot of new research coming out as we understand the brain more. So I'm going to go through this real quickly over a 12-year period of time and just real quickly tell you which medications have come out. Over 10 years ago, we started seeing Chantix, which was a medication to help with the nicotine receptors, which help people craving with smoking. Vivitrol is a form of naltrexone, which helps with opiate addiction. It antagonizes the opiate receptor. Invega is also a new antipsychotic that's been around for a couple of years now. Vyvanse is a new ADHD medication that came out in 2007. The benefit of Vyvanse is it also had a little bit of an antidepressant effect, so people with mood issues actually enjoyed taking the Vyvanse better than the Adderall. The description of some of these medications are on your handouts if you want to understand a little bit more about how they work, if you're interested in that and understanding your patient population a little bit better, because they do work a little bit differently on the brain. For example, Vyvanse introduces the release of dopamine and norepinephrine from the nerve terminals, so it actually increases the stimulation of those neurotransmitters, and it has a little bit of a mood change. Stavzor is a delayed Depakote, a valproic acid substance that came out in 2008. We use that for migraine, seizures, or bipolar disorder, and it's believed to affect directly on the GABA system. In 2009, we saw Intuniv come out, which was an alpha-2 agonist, which was also, it's not a CNS stimulant, but it had some benefit for people with ADHD. Edular is one that's not real common, but it's a sublingual Ambien. So if you see people that are on a medication called Edular, it's a sleep medication. Saffris is also a sublingual tab. We found that by giving people sublingual medications, it did two things. One is it absorbed more quickly, so we knew it'd get into their bloodstream faster, but it also helped us with people who were cheeking their medications. People that would hold them under their tongue, and then when we walked away, they would spit them out. So if we had somebody that had a compliance issue, these new medications made it more effective for us to manage compliance. Fanapt is also another medication used to treat schizophrenia. All of these have, the ones that treat psychosis are blocking mostly the dopamine receptors, which are the positive symptoms of psychosis, hallucinations and delusions. But we know that people that deal with psychotic disorders also have mood problems and cognitive issues. And so one of the nice things about the newer antipsychotics is they also worked on the serotonergic and histamine receptors to actually give people more of an increase in their mood and their cognitive functioning. So instead of back in the 50s to 70s when people just basically became zombies on Thorazine and Haldol, we were able to actually give them the newer atypical antipsychotics, and we were seeing people actually get more into a recovered life where they could return to work and live more independently. So there was a real exciting change in the treatment of people with schizophrenia. In 2010, we saw medication Latuda that came out, which is actually one of my favorites. It treats bipolar depression, but also can treat schizophrenia, and it's also a D2 and 5-HT2A blocker, which helps with mood. And we see a lot of people with bipolar depression that this will pull them out of that depression. Vivitrol is the new naltrexone extended release shot that's given by specialized physicians to treat opiate dependence. You've probably heard of doctors that give Vivitrol or dealt with family members that have been in recovery. In 2011, there was a new Ambien sublingual tab that came out called Intermezzo, and it was a non-benzodiazepine hypnotic. It had less addictive properties to it. Also, we saw Vibrid, which was a new medication that came out to treat major depression. And the neat thing about this is if you look at this nerve, it had the reuptake inhibition, so those little yellow dots would go into the first nerve and block the reuptake of the serotonin. But it also goes to the second nerve and would trigger the receptor, so it actually helped the next nerve get triggered with the serotonin. So it actually had a little more of a stimulating effect. So Vibrid became a new medication with a new property to how it worked on the nerves and the neurotransmitters. And we've seen that come out just a few years ago. Vetsima was a new SNRI and SSRI property. It had both serotonergic and norepinephrine effects, and it was to treat major depression. We don't see it used a lot still, but it's still yet to be seen the success of it. Brintellix is another one that you might hear about. It's more of a serotonergic modulator. This is a little bit different, where serotonin goes out in the system and can affect multiple parts of the system, not just one nerve tract, and it helps treat major depression. In 2014, we saw another Bunavel. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. It's a buccal film that's put inside the mouth that helps with opioid dependence, and it's got the Suboxone and the naloxone properties to it. In 2015, we saw another medication come out for schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, which was an atypical antipsychotic called Vraylar. Some of you may have seen that recently being ordered. And also a new medicine called Rexulti, which is an augmentation to people who are on medication for depression but are not responding very well. And so you'll see doctors order Rexulti on top of their other medications to assist. Also that year, we saw a new medication that was an extended release injection called Aristada, which was a form of Abilify, which we didn't see very many long-acting injectable medications outside of Prolixin and Haldol for a long time. But this gave us some new tools to use with people who are in the community who are not compliant on medication to help us ensure their recovery would stay consistent. In 2016, new Nuplazid came out. This is a combination of an inverse agonist and antagonist activity of serotonin receptors, and it was to treat the psychosis associated with Parkinson's disease. We also saw Daytrana, which is a slow-release patch for ADHD, and we're starting to see this used a little bit more. It's one of the first ones that came out that was a transdermal patch. And another medication that some of you may have heard about is Contrave, which is a weight loss pill that we've tried to use a little bit more with people that have weight gain problems with a side effect of the psychotropic medications, but the insurance companies aren't covering it. But it's basically bupropion, which is Wellbutrin, added to what's called low-dose naltrexone. Some of you may not be familiar with low-dose naltrexone, but they've done studies that says if you take naltrexone, which helps with addiction, and you give it in very small quantities, like instead of 50 milligrams, you give it in 1.5 milligrams, it teases the opiate receptor and creates an endorphin type of action which improves the anti-inflammatory response in the body. And so they're starting to use low-dose naltrexone for chronic pain, for depression, for weight loss, fibromyalgia, different chronic pain issues. And so when they added it to Wellbutrin, they saw that it helped with cravings and helped with weight loss. The other new approach that you probably heard a lot, it's not really new, it's been around for a while, called ketamine. It's been around since the 60s. It was used as an anesthetic in surgery. It was also known as the club drug, which was illegal. But the FDA started studying it, and they found that ketamine, if it was given to people with depression, had almost an immediate effect with some people where within just a few minutes they could actually see an improvement in their mood. And it had this amazing ability to help people that had refractory depression that weren't responding to traditional medications. But it was very expensive. Sometimes it would cost $5,000 just to go, and you'd have to go to California, other states to get it. We now have ketamine clinics in Utah. It costs about $200 to $300 a treatment, but you have to go in about 10 to 12 times to get your ketamine infusions if you're going to see some longer acting results, and sometimes that'll only last for 6 months. So it's something that has to be ongoing, almost like ECT treatments. But the way, and I've already talked about the low-dose naltrexone, so I'll just stay on the ketamine. The way it works is the glutamate and the GABA system have a feedback loop. So if there's too much glutamate, the GABA system will kick in and slow it down. If there's too much GABA, the glutamate system tries to kick in. So they try to work together to help each other. What ketamine does is it goes in and blocks on the glutamate receptor that place that the GABA system comes in and tells it to slow down so the glutamate doesn't stop. And so you have a more propensity to having the excitatory system keep you up. And so it basically allows the glutamate system to pull you up out of that depression by blocking the receptor on the glutamate cell that is the feedback from the GABA system. I don't know if that makes sense, but there's some issues with it because it can lower blood pressure or it can cause increased blood pressure pretty quickly and can cause some problems with your vital signs. And so the clinicians that use it have to be under a very controlled setting when you're receiving the IVs. But it's being seen as fairly safe nowadays and more people are using it. The FDA Advisory Committee recommends now that we approve, and I'm not sure how this is said, but it's an esketamine nasal spray, which people with refractory depression will be able to use and get a similar effect out of a nasal spray. So I think over the next few years, we're going to see a lot of advancements in the use of these non-traditional approaches for the treatment of mental illness. And a lot of our patients who are just dealing with chronic depression are very excited about these things who have not responded. How do we decide as clinicians what medications we use? There's many factors that go into deciding which of these medications we use when we're diagnosed or when we're treating. We have to look at the differential diagnosis and make sure that we're treating the right thing. For example, it's very common to see OCD and bipolar disorder as comorbid disorders. It's very common to get borderline personality disorder mixed up with bipolar disorder. Their symptoms cross over a lot, and you can't diagnose a borderline personality disorder in teenagers. So there's a lot of controversy, but if you're not diagnosing correctly, you might not be treating correctly. Family history is important. We know that the medications are effective, but when you and I swallow a pill, how well I absorb that pill out of my GI tract, how well my liver metabolizes that pill, how much bioavailability of that pill then goes into my bloodstream, how much is able to cross the blood-brain barrier and then get to the cell to work is different for every one of us here because of the way our DNA expresses itself. I do know that if you have a brother or sister on a medication that's working, because your DNAs are similar, it's probably going to work better for you as well. So I will always ask patients, if you have a family member who has responded well to a medication, give us that information because we're going to go down that pathway first. We look at a medical history because we want to know if they have other medical problems. These medications do interact with a lot of our medical medications. We have to look at the tolerability. If a person's dealing with extreme tiredness and it's going to cause lethargy as a side effect, we're not going to give you that medication. We have to do an assessment of the symptoms. If I've got somebody that's very angry and throwing things around the house, I'm going to give them something more that's a little bit more subduing than activating. We have to look at past history of use. I've had patients come into the clinic that say, yeah, I've been on Prozac, Zoloft, Wellbutrin, Effexor, and none of them work. I'm like, well, how long were you on them? Well, I took that one for 2 days and it didn't make me feel better, and I took that one for 6 days and I didn't like the way it made me feel. And I tell them, you really haven't tried any of the medications because you didn't dose them right and you didn't use them correctly. And many family practitioners don't know how psychotropic medications are used, and so they don't work with their patients correctly on these. And so many times people who have a long history of use of different medications will realize you didn't actually have a fair trial of any of those. So it's important to have expertise around how the medications are used. Substance abuse history plays into what kind of meds we order. Cost is an important factor. Patients will get ordered a medication and then go to the pharmacy and it costs them $400 to pick up their prescription. Well, we're not going to do that to the person, so we have to understand that. And then finally, genetic testing. I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but we now have the opportunity to do some genetic testing for our patients. Basically, what this tells us is it gives us a report that tells us how medications are metabolized by different enzymes in the liver and how the body is going to use those medications. And it's not a for sure thing, but it gives us a code that then we can follow. So when that patient's report comes to us, it'll come in with a report of green, yellow, or red. And there are different companies who do this. It's a little oral swab we do. Then we FedEx the swab into the company. They do the testing and send us back the report. What this tells me as a clinician is the medications that are listed under the green are probably the ones that this patient's going to have a better chance to respond to. It's not going to tell me which medication to use. It's just going to tell me these medications, this particular person's DNA, the way it's expressing itself, metabolizes these medications better. So genetic testing is something we're using more often. It used to be pretty expensive. Now there's certain places like GeneSight that will do it, and it might cost you about $150 to have the genetic test done. So it's not super expensive anymore. So if you do know somebody that's being treated and struggling through the medication profile of what to be ordered, you might recommend that they have some genetic testing done with whoever's treating them. Okay, that comes to the end of the medication presentation. We're about out of time. Question? So whatever practitioner you're being treated by, that practitioner sets up an account with the genetic company. For example, I have an account with GeneSight, which is one of the genetic testing sites. They send me the equipment to do the testing. So the testing's done right in the office, and whoever's prescribing for you sends that back for you and gets the report for you. So it's just like ordering lab work, but it's done right in the clinic, the doctor's office. So you just need to ask that whatever clinic you're going to if they have access to genetic testing. And most companies now have been out to many of the psychiatry offices, and most nurse practitioners in psych and psychiatrists are familiar with genetic testing. The insurance will not cover genetic testing right now, and you'll get a scary bill through the mail that says this test now costs $5,000 and you're responsible because we're not going to cover it. But don't worry about that, because what the GeneSight company did is they send the bill to the insurance company just to declare the value of the test. And then they send the patient a separate bill, which you sign an agreement when you do your genetic testing. And the most I've seen anybody charged is $300. Most people are paying around $150. We've had a few, but it's not a common thing we do there, because the patients we get at the state hospital have been in the system for a while, and the doctors, the specialists have been working with them, have known them and work with the, but if we get it somebody new, that would be considered, yes. Any other questions? Okay, that was about a 6-month lecture done in 30 seconds, so I apologize for the fast overview. But I just wanted you to see a few names so you might become familiar when you see those out there and what's out on the horizon for psychopharmacology. It's been a pleasure being with you today. I hope I haven't bored you or put you to sleep, and I hope it's been valuable to you today. So thank you for letting me spend my morning with you.